Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Strongman's Bed, where the magic no longer happens. We're going to react to an iced coffee hour clip, which is hosted by Graham, the insanely tiny Turbo Manlet, and his little bussy buddy, where they interviewed Michael Saylor, the con man extraordinaire, the pumper of Bitcoin, the clown that had a massive run-up in his company's stock during the dot-com bubble, only to see it massively collapse to almost nothing. And I suspect that's going to happen again, because Bitcoin's a scam. So let's listen to Michael Saylor, excuse me, about why you should not invest in the S&P 500, because there's better alternatives out there, right? Let's hear his justification.
The S&P index is simply tracking the currency supply of U.S. dollars for the past 100 years. As when you invest in a diversified portfolio of stocks, you're not making money. All you're doing is preserving the capital that you had. You're not getting poor. You're not getting richer. You're just tracking sideways. You think you're getting...
The S&P 500 is just going up with inflation, apparently. Okay.
richer in nominal terms, but in real terms, you're not. And conventional economists would say they would say real economic growth or real asset growth should be calculated using the CPI. But of course, the CPI, you could reasonably conclude, is the lowest number that any self-respecting government-employed economist could possibly calculate. It is the rate at which an arbitrary portfolio of things the government thinks you should care about is.
Okay, so basically what he's saying is that if you go off the CPI, which is just the absolute lowest rate of inflation, because you can't trust the government at all about anything. They're just lying about everything. Then they're massively underreporting inflation. And if you go off real inflation metrics, which Michael Saylor knows, then in fact, the S&P 500 is not going up faster than inflation. So basically what these Bitcoin pumping clown degenerate losers do is they say the CPI is a lie, it's totally wrong, and the rate of inflation is always exactly probably 5% less than Bitcoin's price. Okay, that's always the rate of inflation. So when Bitcoin goes down, I'm surprised they don't say it's deflation. But he's basically saying the CPI can't be trusted, which even if you couldn't trust it, inflation is not at the point where it's tracking the returns of the S&P 500. If inflation was going up at the rate of the S&P 500, you think inflation's bad now? You would be astronomically poor if inflation was actually going up at the rate of the S&P 500. But, we're going to compare the CPI to the S&P 500 because I actually have a convenient little chart from my military retirement plan that debunks this absolute clown because, yeah, we're actually getting real returns in the S&P 500, including me, which is roughly half my portfolio.
Is going up in price. The true inflation rate, or I'd say the currency debasement rate, the monetary inflation rate is the rate at which the supply of currency is increasing.
Right, and which would be about 7 to 10%.
That's 7 to 10%. Might even be more. I mean, you can actually trace.
But is that actually even if that's true, is that actually reflecting in prices? Now, don't get me wrong, prices have gone up since the clown-demic, 100%. But do you really think it's going up at 7 or 10% per year? Maybe for some items, but for everything? No. And there's actually deflation in a lot of items. Some items get more expensive. Some items get less expensive. But over time, the aggregate goes up roughly at what the CPI is. Okay? So when you go to the grocery store and your beef doubled, that doesn't mean that inflation doubled. That's one item that you could potentially buy. There's things that have gotten cheaper over time. Televisions, etc., etc. Okay? Oh, shadow stats. Oh, I measure inflation based on the money supply. Yeah, I mean, you just pick whatever metric you want to justify why the S&P 500 is, quote unquote, going up at the rate of inflation. Okay, sure, Michael.
Over 100 years, about 7%, but in the past 20, 30 years, It looks like more like 10% in US dollar terms. And weaker currencies, 14%. And the weakest currencies, 20 to 30% a year.
Do you think that's going to stop anytime soon?
No.
You see, the fact that Graham is little turbo man is sitting there, not even questioning him, just taking it all in. Oh, the rate of the currency debasement is actually 10% per year. And blah, 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 blah. And I'm a clown and a con man and a Bitcoin popper. He just takes it and doesn't even say anything about it. He just nods along like a little doofus. Graham is a con. He'll take on anybody on his podcast that's famous, that spurts out garbage ideas, regardless of how they may potentially hurt people, because it enriches him. It gets eyeballs. Oh, I interviewed Michael Saylor. What a freaking con.
No, it's impossible for it to stop because governments everywhere in the world just spend more money than they take in taxes. And so the temptation is always just to print money to pay bills, either to fight wars, or to implement government policy. If I'm going to forgive student debt, if I'm going to fight a war, if I'm going to implement a medical policy, if I'm going to, pay a bureaucracy, I have to come up with money to do it.
How long is that?
I wonder how you could hedge that. Oh, by, real productive assets in the economy. Basically, what Michael Saylor is saying is that all the price returns of the S&P 500 have come from simply inflation, simply from the expansion of the money supply. Apparently, workers have not become more productive. Companies have not become more profitable. Technology has not improved. No, it's all inflation. Nothing has improved over the last 20 or 30 years, right? I remember when we had dial-up internet. I think things have become more productive and efficient over the last 30 years. And I think the largest companies in America have utilized that to increase their corporate profits and expand profit margins. The S&P 500's returns are real. Even if you don't trust the CPI, they're still real. And what's the alternative? Some made-up freaking coin that does nothing? Yeah, you don't understand.
Sustainable for?
It depends on which currency you're printing.
I guess let's talk about the dollar.
Well, let's talk about ones that are simpler. Let's talk about El Salvador.
Okay.
If you have a small country and you print your currency and you get into a civil war, you print a lot of currency. Well, when you print that currency, the currency collapses. And so normally it's sustainable for about 4 to 8 years in the event of a real war. When does that happen in the U.S.? It happened in most colonies before the Revolutionary War. They all collapsed their currency every 40 years or so. It happened to the United States Continental Congress. Have you ever heard the phrase, it's not worth the continental? During the Revolutionary War, the United States government printed its own money, greenbacks, and I think they just printed continentals, and they expanded the currency supply by a factor of 200. And so the entire currency collapsed, and everybody that took those things was bankrupt by 1785 or something. So in the event of a war, your currency collapses pretty quickly. The losing side in World War I, the currency collapsed. And between 19...
Hey, Michael, how many cryptocurrencies have collapsed to zero? So he talks about how, currency, there's all these currencies and countries that have weak institutions and are not economic powerhouses, or they have massive wars, their currency collapses. What about crypto? I bet you 80-90% of all cryptos have collapsed to zero. Okay? And tell me, what's the difference between crypto and a currency issued by a government? Well, a government can actually use its own currency to meet its needs in times of war or bad economic times. Why would governments allow cryptocurrency to usurp that privilege? They're not gonna do it, pinheads.
14 and 1917, the currencies in France and the UK were about to collapse. The only thing that saved them was the U.S. entry into the war. So generally, in the event of a war, why do wars last 5 years? Because if the government's printing money as fast as they can, it takes about 5 years to suck all the economic energy out of the society. In the Civil War,
wars last a lot longer than 5 years. Maybe if you're thinking about World War I, Or World War II, which was actually about 6 years. Or if you even start when the Japanese invaded China, even longer than that. But wars can definitely last for a much longer time before the currency collapses, okay? There's been wars all over the freaking world that have lasted for decades or even centuries. What are you talking about? I'm such a historian of history. My name is Michael Saylor. And all this, of course, leads to you buying Bitcoin. This is somehow bullish for a made-up coin instead of, trusting in the currency of a sovereign country, especially one as wealthy as the United States and as powerful as the United States. So the CPI is fake. All currencies collapse. Therefore, I should buy crypto. Or maybe you become a partial owner of productive assets in the society. Maybe that's another alternative, okay? Because even if the currency changes, if you have a factory and you're using one currency one day and one currency the next day, you still have the freaking factory. It's still there and you're a partial owner of it. What do you have with crypto? A coin that goes up and you buy it because it goes up because you're slow.
The North printed greenbacks. They collapsed and they were almost worth nothing by the end of the Civil War. The South printed their currency that collapsed by the end of the war. So
yes, governments print currency. And governments, even under the gold standard, governments were printing currency. Okay? Governments will do what they need to do to fight wars. No freaking standard is going to stop them from doing that.
So in wars, the currency can collapse in 5 years. If you take Argentina's collapsed their currency about every 20 or 25 years for the past 150 years. About 20 years.
Sure.
So the Argentine peso was 1 peso to the dollar about 25 years ago. It's 1,000 pesos to the dollar right now. So, you can see the same thing in Nigeria. So in a third tier currency, it'll last about, third tier currency, I would say a third tier currency is in a war. The currency's collapsed in 5 to 10 years. Second.
Man, that's a lot longer than cryptocurrencies, which are backed by memetics and basement-dwelling, neck-bearded clowns.
Tier currency that collapsed in about 20, 25 years. First tier currency, the world reserve currency is, say, the United States. Compare the United States, the dollar. Compare it to the German currencies. The Germans have lost 2 wars, so their currencies collapsed like 3 times. Mm-hmm. How about
So the currency collapses, therefore Bitcoin goes up in currency-denominated units. No, it doesn't. It does. It's ones and zeros. I don't understand how Bitcoin is a hedge against anything. It's not. It's a freaking meme. I don't care how large of a market it is. It's a global freaking pump and dump scam that has no value. At least when you buy the S&P 500, which has underperformed inflation, which we're going to look at in a second, you still own stuff. So speaking of the S&P 500, so in the Army, you get the TSP, right? Let's hope this thing freaking didn't close on me. I think. Okay, here it is. So you can see the green going up, right? The green is the returns of the S&P 500. You see that little gray line on the bottom? That's inflation. Does it look like the S&P 500 has perhaps outpaced inflation? But you can't trust those numbers. No. Pull up the chart of Bitcoin. Even though the S&P 500 is 500 plus of some of the most productive, profitable companies in the world that provide real goods and services. No, pull up the chart of Bitcoin. If you're going to be a Bitcoin shill, why even lie? Why lie that it's basically matched to the CPI or matched the real inflation, matched the money supply expansion? You're just lying, and by the fact that you're lying, it reveals that you're a duplicitous scam artist clown. Why lie? Just say facts. Because you're a scammer, Michael Saylor. Con man, I can't wait till your company implodes, your garbage levered up Bitcoin clown fund.
The Japanese currency. It's collapsed, right? How about every other currency? The Russian currency. It's collapsed about 3 or 4 times. The last time it collapsed was 1998. Lebanon, it just collapsed a few years ago. U.S. won every war in the last 100 years. We are actually the strongest nation for the past 100 years. So we're the victor. We're the world reserve currency. So what has the U.S. dollar done? An acre of land in Miami Beach where I live cost $10,000 100 years ago. It costs $10 million today.
Somehow that's a reflection of the debasement of the currency, or maybe certain parts of the country have insanely high demand and prices have gone astronomical, but that's not reflective of the entire debasement of the currency. He's pointing to a specific example where prices went up significantly. Very localized scenarios. The currency has not been debased that much. Are you freaking crazy? Do you really think that's true? You like that example? Okay. Oh, El Salvador and Miami Beach, and I'm going to lie about inflation because it helps me, prove my point that you should buy my worthless token and to not invest in the S&P 500. Michael Saylor does not want you to invest in the S&P 500. Think about that, okay? I'm a VT shill, but the S&P 500 is a big part of my portfolio. And guess what? I'd rather own that than a worthless scam token.
Okay. Did the currency collapse? It's worth 0.1%. Right?
Graham, you're not going to question, but hey, that's just one part of the country. No, you're not even going to ask.
Lost 99.9% of its value. So, in fact, that's the winner. Right? And how long will that go on? How long can it go on? I mean, at 7%, you can presumably do it another 30, 40, 50 years, something like that. But the world reserve currency goes to the end. It'll last until the mercantile empire fails. Where you see the fraying on the edges is you see the collapse of the Sri Lankan currency. You see the collapse of every currency in Africa, the collapse of the currency in Nigeria, the collapse of the currencies in Lebanon, the collapse of, or the weakening of currency.
It's fraying on the edges because some clown country with an unstable government had their currency collapse. Oh my God, time to buy Bitcoin for some reason.
Currencies in Turkey, you see that right now. Turkish lira has fallen by 75% against the dollar in the last 36 months. Generally, the biggest risk...
Go look at the Turkish stock market. I bet you it's gone up a lot, at least in lira terms.
...is in the second tier, third tier country. In a third tier country, your currency's broken, right? So what do? Normally, you actually just flip to the dollar. That's why is there so much demand for Tether, right? Stable coins. If you live in Argentina, you live in Nigeria, you live anywhere in Africa, it's like the dollar looks like a pretty good idea. Everybody knows what the dollar is. If your currency's falling 30% a year and the dollar's only falling in value 7% a year, it looks like the dollar is gaining, right? Whatever, 20, 25% a year.
Right.
Because your currency, your economic system is so relatively weak. So what you have is you have a whole world that goes through this currency collapse. Is this new? No, it's not new. If you read the history of the world, go read, there's 15,000 pages of Durant's Story of Civilization. I read it for fun. I reread it for fun. There's thousands.
He didn't read that.
Of stories of an empire rising, the first king conquers, the son maintains, the third one in the line comes along and decides to overreach, overspend, debases the currency, bleeds the people dry, eventually can't pay the military and it collapses. And what happens is they always blame it on the barbarians. It's like the bad people that live next door, they abused us. But what really happens is,
I wonder who they're going to blame when MicroStrategy inevitably collapses in one of the most epic annihilation events in stock market history. Who are they going to blame? The feds, the deep state. I can't wait to see it. I'm going to laugh.
every single empire in the past 10,000 years that we've got a recorded history on, they go through this dynamic of they're weak and virtuous.
Therefore, buy Bitcoin. I'm not understanding. I can't grasp how this is going to convince me to buy some random blockchain clown token. What's the logic? It's like the chain of logic is broken. They go, currency debasement, therefore Bitcoin. It's like the gnome meme or whatever it is. Do this, blank, profit. Currency debasement, blank, Bitcoin. Where's the connection? There is none.
Struggle. They rise against another adversary. The big, strong empire becomes fat, dumb, happy. It becomes corrupted from within. The Roman Empire, the French Empire, the Russians, the whatever, fill in the blank. And after the empire becomes corrupted within it, collapses, a new empire rises. It stays virtuous for some amount of time. It might be 50 years, it might be 100 years, it might be 200 years. Eventually it becomes corrupted, it collapses. And this is just the story of civilization.
Okay, so currency's collapsed, and therefore you should buy Bitcoin. Don't buy the S&P 500. Don't have a total world stock market index fund. No. Buy Bitcoin, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, that concludes the video. What do you think about the format? I decided to do it on my bed because I was lazy. Check out the pinned comment if you want tax preparation from a certified public accountant. I do business and personal taxes anywhere in the United States. And if you're an expat, if you want a sponsored video or you want one-on-one tutoring or you want to buy my book, Stop Being a Broke Loser, they're also in the pinned comment below. You guys have a wonderful evening. Cheers!